conversation. Welcome, and ladies and gentlemen, welcome to, on the 14th of March, 2022, welcome to part of our activities during Women's Week and part of our university Arab classes, and for those students doing a double degree in journalism and humanities at the Carlos III University in Madrid. So we'll present this conference within that cycle. I'm going to ask a little favor, because we forgot to give our guest a headset for listening to the interpreting. So I request that you bring her one. So this conference will be in English with simultaneous interpreting. And I believe that most of you, from what I can see, understand English perfectly well. And if not, you're still in time to get some headsets for simultaneous interpreting. And we're also going to be broadcasting or streaming this session on our YouTube channel. Canal 2. Channel 2, testing. Channel 2, can you hear the interpreting? Testing. This is the English translation. So we are particularly interested to underline, as I was saying, this bringing together of two different things. And one is the fact that in Casa Árabe, we are concerned and we're interested in exploring the gender issues. And March is not the only month when we do this, but this helps us to concentrate these activities in this week and to underline the role and the importance of women, and in particular in the world of journalism and communication, which is the objective of this conversation for this afternoon. The freedom of information, for those of you who do not follow this closely, and I think that in your case you do, obviously brings up a lot of challenges all over the world, in fact, but in particular in the Middle Eastern area and North African areas in the world. And this area that's known for many reasons, but in particular because of its conflicts and its trouble spots, which are recurring or endemic in nature and related to violence. And also it's characterized by a series of repressive regimes which control populations with an iron fist in order to maintain and hold on to power and to protect the interests of the political elite. When the Arab Spring took place or started in 2011, the population of some countries showed a great thirst for freedom through their fight to open way spaces in the media and in social media. And it is true to say that some spaces were opened up and were conquered, and some walls of fear were knocked down, and walls of repression. But I think that the situation on a global level has not improved, because this pendulum, which has led to a revolution, has also brought about a counter-revolution. And so in absolute terms, I think that in reality, things have not necessarily improved, especially if we look at the map of Reporters Without Frontiers that I have in my office. The red areas and black areas, in fact, the red areas have actually become black areas, increasingly so, and therefore it really isn't a very promising outlook. So being an independent journalist is a professional option with many ups and downs, but in Middle East and Northern Africa, the MENA area, it makes it a very dangerous job, in particular with the levels of impunity that exist in the region. But being a woman actually adds another series of difficulties and challenges that include sexism, gender stereotypes, sexual harassment, and women journalists who inform on matters to do with their communities to the media are not free from these challenges or internal discrimination that they face up to in their homes. from people who are close to them, their own families, and also that post-colonial bias that is exercised by their colleagues and Western media. So therefore, through the experience of our guest for today, Zaina Erhaim, these matters will be dealt with in the professional and vital development of women journalists in the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa. So it's a great pleasure for me to welcome our speaker today, and also Leila Naushawati, a teacher in communication at the University of Carlos III in Madrid, friend and collaborator of Casa Árabe, and she has been in close contact with Zeina for a decade now, at least, and I think that this is the first time they've actually met in person. So it's a great pleasure for us to be able to facilitate this meeting between them and to have you all here this afternoon with us. So without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Leila so that she can talk to us a little bit about the subject for today, and for her to present Zeina to us, and also to talk about this double degree in journalism and humanities, because I know you know what it is, but it's for people who are watching us via YouTube and who might not know what it's all about. Well, thank you very much to all those of you who have come this afternoon. I don't know how many of you there are. I see most of you are students from the dual degree in journalism and humanities and communication at the University of Carlos III in Madrid. So thank you very much for having come. I think it's very important to do things outside the classroom. Many of you are coming to the end of your degree programs, and it's more important than ever for you to get to know how the world out there works and what a journalist faces up to. A lot has been said lately about what it means to cover a war, and many people who are starting out are very excited and they want to cover conflicts because it's important, because it's fundamental and essential. I carry on talking in Spanish. Is that okay? Yes?
No lo sé.
Well, you are getting simultaneous interpreting, aren't you?
And do you hear the translation to Spanish, Zeina? Yeah?
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Oh, you don't need translation? No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. To English. Okay. Yeah. So at this moment, it's more important than ever to remember how important it is to have voices on the ground, to have people traveling to countries at war, to bear witnesses. And it's an extremely dangerous job that I think should be done with the support of big agencies, networks. I know many of you are now asking me, how can I go to Ukraine? How can I cover this? But I think it's very, very important to have someone backing you up from institutionally, a big network. It's very risky to just go cover a war without having lots of resources, lots of knowledge, and lots of knowing what's coming. In the case of some people like Zeina, they just met with this situation when they were there. So it's as important to go and cover wars and conflicts as it is to actually contact people who are working on the ground, who know the language, who know the local sources, who know how to interpret it, what's happening, because otherwise we lack context, we lack knowledge of the internal dynamics. We may have good intention, but we do lack a lot of internal dynamics that are important to understand what's at stake and how to provide context. So I think it's very relevant, as much as you can, to try and find and meet people who actually know the countries, who actually know the context. And I think this is a key opportunity to learn from someone who is extremely brave and who is extremely candid also and open about the challenges people experience when covering these kind of conflicts. I remember her talking a few years ago on Twitter, on social media. You were asking Spanish people who went through the post-Civil War how they dealt with the civil war, the defeat. I think you're always looking for bonds and links with people who have faced conflict in different contexts. And she also shares the toll that this takes at a personal level, even mental health-wise. And this is something we have talked in class as well, how to preserve and to try to take care of our mental health in terms of what we expose ourselves to and how we relate to the content and the information we work with. So Zeina, I'm really, really looking forward to hearing what you can tell us, because it's been a while since we heard from each other. And
may I just interrupt? I will just, for the benefit of the people who haven't read her biography, I will just introduce Zeina briefly. Zaina Erhaim es una periodista siria.
She is a Syrian journalist who is an award winner and works in communication and gender with different international associations in the Middle East and North Africa. And she participated, working on 3 books to do with women and journalism, including Women on the Ground, and has worked with the IWPR, which is the Institute for World Peace Reporting, as a manager for communications for 8 years, and before that she was a journalist for the BBC. She writes for different media like Newslines magazines, Open Democracy, Al Modon, amongst others, and she has a master in international journalism from the City University in London. So without further ado, Zaina, you have the floor.
I'm sorry, I'm going to be speaking in English. I need some more work to be able to present in French. I just want to make sure that you're all okay with that, and those who don't understand it have the translation. Okay, so I hope I'm not going to be encouraging you from actually going out and doing the work, but as Layla has said, I'm trying to be frank. I would have loved in your age to have someone like me, encouraging me and pushing me further to think twice before taking any decision. So I think I would have loved to be in your place instead of mine. What I'm going to be trying to do today in the coming half an hour is try to take you in some of my thoughts organized in this tiny paper to speak with you about my own experience as a Middle Eastern journalist. I will certainly give more examples about Syria because this is where I'm from and I lived most of my life in. But also, I was privileged for the last couple of years to be able to work with other women from the MENA region, specifically in Iraq, Egypt, Yemen, and Lebanon, which widen my horizons and enable me to even see things differently without my own region. So I'm going to start by speaking generally on what is it to be a local journalist domestically, because I'm going to be separating it from internationally. And this is for both men and women journalists in the region. In general, I can generalize and say that generally in the region, you're either a propagandist or you would rather not exist. Because it is very challenging for many reasons. First, I'm going to be referring to what Karim has mentioned about the RSF Index for Freedom of Expression. Most of the MENA countries are on the bottom of that list of a freedom of press. I actually grasp some of the countries. For example, Tunis is the first on that list, and it's 73. The list is 180 countries. And the last country, the last Arabic country on the RSF index, which is Reporters Without Borders index, is Syria. Syria has been competing on the last positions of the list since 2011. At some point, I think 2015, Syria hit the last. It even comes after North Korea in terms of the suppression of press freedom and media freedom. According to Committee to Protect Journalists, there are at least 100 journalists in detention. That's in MENA region, and that number is certainly far less than the actual ones because many are even missing. Their families wouldn't even know whether they're detained, they're assassinated, they're imprisoned, kidnapped. They just disappear from the streets and no one knows what is happening. Above this systematic suppression applied by many governments, tyrannies, which is systematic, it's central, like Saudi Arabia, like Egypt, which are turned into the biggest jails for journalists. There is a social pressure, which now with the social media is becoming even harsher on journalists who are trying not to be propagandalists, not just for the government, not to be propagandalist or extreme on like gender roles, on currents, or anything that is common. So polarization, especially after the Gulf dispute, has become a very big issue. So with the Gulf dispute, it happened a couple of years ago where the Emiratis and Saudi decided to boycott Qatar, and it was a big deal. It affected the Arabic media scene largely because most of the big publications and media outlets are either funded by the Saudi Arabia and Emirati camp or the other. And I'm not speaking about only the Arab ban media. I'm speaking about local ones. For example, from the Syrian context, there was a TV channel that is funded by Emirates, UAE, and another one that is funded by Qatar. And at the peak time of the dispute between the two countries, those two supposedly Syrian TV stations were publishing scandals about each other. So the fight was pretty much between those two Syrian entities because their donors are having that fight. So there is the polarization that, or being propaganda that is imposed by the state. There is another one that's financial, economical, that is imposed by mainly the Gulfi donors, which are like the main donors of the Arabic media. And then there is the social one that I'm going to be speaking about a lot, especially within the women journalist context. To be independent is dangerous for media and for journalists. One of the main elements is that generally in the MENA region, there are no rules, entities, institutions to protect journalists. There are even laws criminalizing journalists, like the laws in Syria, in Egypt, and they're very general. You can't even, for example, there is a law to criminalize anything against the Ba'ath revolution. The Ba'ath is the controlling party of Syria. So that could be literally criticizing the head of a small branch. And it could be discrediting the act of the whole party. This general accusation, which is within the law itself, it even criminalizes any act. An investigative piece that could be speaking about medicine or corruption within the pharmacy industry that is linked to someone that is related to the regime could get you into the prison. So it's not just about the corruption, but it's about like state mafia, literally. To be independent away from those entities, laws are not on your side. Institutions are certainly not on your side. No sustainable funding. You're struggling to put your materials out. And above that, when you're in trouble, despite the whole international support, you be independent, you go, you produce these critical pieces. When local journalists are actually in trouble, very few things are being done to protect them, to relocate them, or to help them out. Funding difficulties, sustainable, it is a daily struggle. Sadly, now I can name 3 or 4 independent media outlets that are still active in the MENA region, and they're facing huge, very huge difficulties, and they're mostly blocked. For example, there is Mada Masr. If you're not following them, they actually have an English Twitter. They're an independent media in Egypt. Lots of journalists who even write with them, they have a travel ban. They're not allowed to travel. Their website is blocked. The head, the editor-in-chief, who's a very smart and powerful woman, she was arrested a couple of times, and I'm not sure whether she's allowed to travel. She won numerous international ones. Was she?
She wasn't allowed to.
She wasn't, yeah. And one of its founders, Aula, has been in prison for the last 2 years, and he just got extra years to spend. This is just one example. So being independent, above all that, facing all the block, but they're still there, and they're still trying to provide independent information within Egypt. Military rule, tyranny, corruption, surveillance, and impunity are all certainly against independent journalists and are a constant threats for lots of media outlets and journalists in the region. Sadly, even Tunis, which used to be our brightest example of the uprising, is turning now, after the latest events, into a kind of scary example. It's coming towards us, I mean, the Levant more. We've seen a queer activist, she was taken into court for something that she posted on social media. And this is Tunis for us. It's like the US in terms of respecting human rights and freedom of expression, quotes, quotes.
Sure, the position, the 73rd position that Tunis was occupying has lowered.
Not yet, but might be after the latest event. But I mean, in general, for us, for Tunis to start cracking down on journalists and bloggers is a very scary act, because it's supposed to be the best in terms of democracy and respecting media freedom compared to the rest of the countries. The censorship, I don't know if I can actually give you an insight about what does it mean to be censored. I lived all my life in Syria. I got the internet for the first time, I think I was 16, and we only had a very slow land internet, which would cut whenever my mom received a call. So you can imagine how much I had fights with my mom whenever I was trying to access the internet. Despite the fact that I was actually working for a local website in 2006 and 7, I didn't know, and I was 23 by then, I didn't even know until then that I was living under a dictatorship. I didn't even know that we had prisons, detainees of conscience. I accidentally once was Googling something, and I was able to access a blocked website because the server of that local website was in the US. For the first time ever at the age of 23, I realized that there was a movement to change the regime in 2000, and that more than 100 people were detained. And I was living in the same city, not just the same country. Being disconnected and brainwashed by the state media, I think you're lucky not to understand it or not being able to imagine it. When I see myself in my teenage years holding the picture of the previous president, the tyrant Hafez al-Assad, and going into the streets because I wasn't veiled, unlike most of the girls in my hometown, usually they would put me in the front as their way to whitewash the dictators. And you see, we have girls who are blonde and they're not wearing a headscarf. So usually they would put me at the beginning of the march, holding his picture and chanting my voice out. Seeing it now, I don't think there is any living example but North Korea, which is pretty much similar. I lived like that until the age of 23. And then I had access, the privilege to have access to information, to be able to challenge all of this state-fed propaganda is unbelievable. I was speaking with Karim earlier. I studied journalism in Damascus, and my teachers were all graduates from Soviet Union. So you're lucky you have Layla. I was like, they were literally teaching me how to be a propagandalist. This is what good journalism for them. The only one who wasn't coming from Soviet Union was studied in Egypt. And actually, she was the one who was encouraging us to think beyond the propaganda. So surveillance is a numerous challenge. It's not a challenge only for journalists, but even if you have access, if your audience is not even allowed to check what you're writing, to check your page, to check your website, and are only forced to listen to one source of information, it's very difficult to make them actually see the other picture or give them another perspective. There is the social and the public censorship, and it also affects the polarization that we're witnessing. And at some cases, the regimes, the tyrants, the dictators, they don't really care about like a small specific social issues, like gender equity. Sometimes they even tolerate some roles related to LGBTQ or even minorities. It doesn't affect the general political scene. But then comes the role of the social surveillance. Many journalists, even bloggers, who dare to write pieces empathizing with a trans person or speaking about gender discrimination or even racial discrimination, even within our region, or speaking about Kurdish or other nationalities that live in us, as we're called the Arab world, but we're not actually the Arab world. They face fierce, systematic campaigns by the public that eventually, in many cases, force them to step back. So above all that political, military, economic suppression, there is yet another extra one. Now, if you say the word feminist, nasawiye in Arabic, you will have at least 10 people backlashing, writing. And sadly, that's not even just in Arabic. I tweeted, I think 2-3 days ago, there was a woman in a news organization. They prepared a list of women journalists covering Ukraine war. I only tweeted the list, saying that as a woman journalist who covered her war earlier, I know that those women are seeing things differently and they should be followed. And the backshots that I got, and I was like, it's enough for white women taking everything on their gender perspective. You feminists make everything about you. I'm not even white. So, I mean, and that's international, and I was tweeting in English, so you can imagine what would that turn into when it's being said in Arabic, directing to conservative societies or closed-minded societies and communities. Emergency or suppressive laws, which I spoke about it earlier, criminalized, or even those the lawyers who are defending journalists who are being criminalized are also facing criminal acts themselves for defending the journalists. So that was speaking about journalism in general. But in every single element that I mentioned, there is an extra thing that applied only on women, especially local women, I'm speaking now. The patriarchal rules in terms of who is able to study journalism, who is able to travel to the city that has a medical school, a media school, how women are being perceived when working as a journalist. There is a general sense that women journalists are too liberated for our communities because they mix with men, because they work outside, because they sleep in hotels, their face might be on TV, their voice on radio. That's all forbidden in our social norms, especially in our, I'm speaking about my own community, which is very conservative. That was all a taboo. When I decided to study journalism, there was an emergency family meeting. And there is a huge alarm. And okay, we tolerated that you're not putting a headscarf. And we dealt with the backshed of our community for that. But doing journalism, that's a red line. Lots of the comments were saying that I'm going to be a prostitute for being a journalist, because that's the perspective. You sleep with people to be able to get on TV. You sleep with people to be able to get your salary and be a journalist. Certainly, I was told I'm going to be spinster for the rest of my life, and I got married twice so far. The patriarchal rules start from deciding to do journalism until you actually do the journalism, how you're being perceived by your sources, by your editors, being underestimated for whatever you do. Whatever position you reach, you will always be questioned. And in many cases, they would ask with whom she slept, that she would take that. Because they can't really understand that you can gain this within your own mind. And I think as a trainer, as a woman trainer, I was doing training for men in Syria, which very few trainers can go in and work with them. So I was their only chance to be trained on journalism, and none of them had any experience at all. And despite that, it took me 2 days to convince them that I have the adequate knowledge and ability to train them with a master's degree from Britain, with 7 years of experience then in journalism. But it was very difficult for them to accept that there is a woman who understands a little bit more than them. Traditions, it's also a great struggle, not just in, I think, conservative societies, in most of the societies in our region, for a woman to be out, to be vocal, to be in public space, it is very dangerous, not just for her, but for her family. If a woman journalist did something wrong, or maybe right, but just against the norm of the traditions, the first thing that they're going to be attacking is her family, her name, her honor, her body, how she looks. No one is going to be questioning her ideas, her writing, her perspective, her sources. Stereotyping and sexism is also very much present, a challenge for women who are trying or working as a journalist in the region. Even within TV channels or media outlets, if you're a woman, okay, you can be an anchor, you can be a presenter, you can be the face, but how many can actually make it into editors, decision-making, owners? The numbers would go down. So on the very low level, junior level, there are plenty of women, but very few make it to the top because of all those dimensions I made. Certainly there is discrimination locally against local women because they're women. Restrictions, especially in the conflicts. There were many areas that are forbidden for women. When my hometown, I'm from a small province in northern Syria, it's called Idlib. It became trending for the very wrong reasons when 2 ISIS leaders were killed in it. When the rebels took over my hometown, every civilian was going out. And as a woman, you're only expected to be civilian. They don't even understand that you can be a journalist, and journalist is a third category. Everyone was going out. That was 2015. I was the only civilian car going in. They didn't allow me in. And I was like, that's my home. My family is stuck there. I'm just going in to take them out. They didn't allow me in for the first time. I had to come the second day. And with someone knowing someone from a military battalion, I was allowed in. Because I am a woman, I'm just expected to run away from the conflict. Even being a local and going back home for them was like too much to absorb, too much to understand. And I'm speaking about an area full of civilians. So imagine if a woman decided to go to frontline or cover a battle or even film in one of the prisons. It's impossible. Once I deploy actually my male friends to do that on my behalf, even in a crowded souk, in a crowded market, where being a woman and holding a camera might drag lots of attention, and attention in such circumstances means trouble. I would ask a male friend. I taught lots of my male friends around me how to hold the camera and take the right shots because I need to count on them to take that on my behalf. And certainly sexual harassment is an issue with Arabic media in specific. And most of those influential decision makers, they take advantage that women are not protected by the laws, and they are always being blamed when they are speaking about being sexually harassed. They're always being questioned. So they are silent many times, silent by their community, silent by their laws, and silent by the harassers who take advantage of all that. There is now a case in the Egyptian court against a journalist who's very brave. Her name is Rasha, because she emphasized with the victim of a sexual harasser who is a filmmaker. So the filmmaker who sexually harassed 6 women, who spoke publicly about it, is now actually taking the journalist who supported them into court for his libelous cause, I think, maybe.
Slander, defamation.
Defamation. So imagine how powerful and how much impunity they enjoy to dare to take such an act. So now going from the domestic level into the international level, I did this very simplified comparison between local journalists and foreign correspondents to let you know how different layer of discrimination applied between the two, domestically and internationally. For local journalists, there are lots of restricting personal documents. For example, the Arabic Center has been struggling for the last 2 weeks to get me a visa to get here, and I am a refugee in Britain, so Spain can be rest assured I wouldn't be applying for asylum, and I'm very privileged. Moving around, even within the MENA region, for me, is mission impossible because I am of Arabic origin. So we have lots of restrictions as local journalists, I'm speaking now. Lots of restrictions related to what kind of documents that we have, what kind of residencies, where we're allowed in, and where we're not. And that's certainly not the case for any international journalist who can go freely to wherever they want. For local journalists, there is no other home to flee to. You can't do a scoop about a case, a drug dealer, a warlord, and just run to your home and be with your family. This is your home. You need to think twice about the story that would cause you your life. You need to think twice about the consequences, and you can't burn out your boats, as we say. For foreign journalists, reporting is a mission they finish, and they go back home, and that's also for the mental level. They can distinguish between their work and their life. And despite that, we know that even many foreign journalists, they do face PTSD issues. For local journalists, threats target extended family. It's not only them, unlike for the international journalists. And that's very harsh. Like, even if you're living abroad, you have many journalists from the region who, until they are a refugee, they change their life. Some of them even change their names, but they still can't dare to speak out about violations committed in their home countries because their families are living there. And this is a method used by many regimes in the region. They can just arrest, harass, and take revenge of the family members of the journalists. Many local journalists work without insurance, without health insurance, without security trainings, without any equipment. And even those who work with international organizations, local journalists working for international organizations, they don't get this. And there are many justifications used by international media saying, well, we can't get them the equipment, we can't get them out of the country to give them the HIFAT, hostile environment and first aid training. It's very expensive. This is their home, they know better. Lots of justifications. But if they want to send anyone within their core team, core staff, international, they would certainly not send them without all the adequate training, information, equipment. There was one issue even, you cannot, the insurance company, certainly very expensive when you're sending a journalist into war zone or when in areas that they can get kidnapped. But there are many arrangements that was discussed, for example, within the Syrian conflict. You want to hire people, you can just get them an agreement with a hospital in Lebanon and a hospital in Turkey, which is neighboring countries. So if something happened, you don't have to pay for an insurance company, you just keep them insured within this specific hospital. But even those suggestions were rejected. And I think that's not related to any financial issues. It's more about how local journalists are being seen and perceived. And this is the post-colonial attitude toward them rather than, I would say, financial struggle. Local journalist objectiveness is always questioned because you're too close from the story, because you are there, because you're reporting about your own issues. While international journalists, no matter what their political views are, no matter where they're coming from, they're always being perceived by international media, not just as impartial, but in many cases as experts. And if you just check now, most of the English-speaking, this is what I know, TV channels, you would say a journalist who spent maybe a year in Ukraine back in 2000, and they will be able to speak as an expert on the subject matter. But when they're hosting Ukrainian or any local journalist, you're only expected to share your own story because this is what you're expert about. You can't actually speak on anything else. And that's personally what pushed me to stop doing any events where I speak about Syria. Okay, you don't trust me as a feminist, as a journalist, despite my experience, I'm done sharing my own. The main source of stories for local journalists, they are the main source of most of the stories, but they're very rarely being credited. I'm not sure what's your position about this fixers. I think Leila mentioned, but for me, there is an ethical question about hiring interpreters and fixers and sources, and then ending up only putting your own name on the byline, despite the fact that the only thing that you did is actually writing it up. For the international journalists, their governments would follow up with them if they're in danger, unlike local journalists who are most probably are the ones are being attacked by their governments. Their government is the main monster following them and targeting them. And that also gives foreign journalists more privilege in terms of traveling, ability. They know that they can be protected by their passport, something I don't think I will ever understand as a Syrian. Local journalists are, even local journalists who graduated from media school, who has been working as journalists, are being treated internationally as fixers, as a source, sometimes as an eyewitness, but very rarely they're being treated as journalists, co-authors, co-writers, and being put there in the pieces that are being produced. While foreign journalists are always credited, treated like experts on the countries that they cover. These are just a glimpse of a very long list. I wanted to tell you because our topic today is women journalists. Those are some inspiring women I worked with on different levels. On the far right, that is left for you? Yes, you're left. And that's Nidal Ayoub. Nidal is a Lebanese journalist, and she is, I think, one of the bravest journalists I've ever met. She's a feminist too. When the uprising in Lebanon started, she was writing about it, she was participating in it, and she was doing lots of pieces about the Syrian refugees and about the domestic worker. I don't know if you're familiar, in Lebanon, they have, like the Gulf, the enslaved system, where they actually, it's a human trafficking. They get women from Philippines, Ethiopia, they take their passports and they force them to work. It's literally modern enslavement. She's one of the very few vocal advocates against that system to demolish it. When she wrote about the Syrian refugees with empathy, more like advocating for their rights, one of the pro-Iranians, pro-Syrian regime journalists did a whole campaign against her, and he's very famous, and he has, I think, 1 million followers. He did a video claiming that she is a spy for Israel, and she is a propagandist. And after she raised a defamation case against him, he created another case, and he took her to court. And certainly, the government didn't act to her case, and they didn't even take him into interrogation, but they directly responded to him. And she was, well, luckily she wasn't imprisoned, but she was taken to detention centers so many times. When I spoke with her about what's the difference between her being a woman and just being a general journalist who writes pro-human rights pieces and advocate for human rights, and she told me the main difference is how many penis messages we get on our messages, on our like DMs and private messages. And she said, whenever I get like 100, I know that I did something big and I would be very proud of myself, because this is the way that they respond. It's very sexist. They don't even realize that this is sexual harassment. This is something that no man journalists would get, whatever they do. Next to her is Fadma al-Bahali. She is Iraqi from al-Basra. She's actually not a journalist. She's a head of a women organization, but I was working with her last year on a production of a women radio program. So she coordinates and does lots of media production. Because of her work, al-Basra is an area that's mainly controlled by al-Hashd al-Sha'bi and Iranian-funded militias. 2 years ago, her son was assassinated, and it was a claim that he committed suicide, but she knew he was actually assassinated for her, for what she's doing for her work. And last year, while we're working on an episode about the extra struggles Iraqi women journalists face, her second son was assassinated, who is with her in that picture. And now certainly she's completely silenced. She closed her organization and we stopped the radio program. Next to her is Merlin Hassan. She's a Palestinian journalist. She just won the Independence Award by Reporters Without Borders. She has a travel ban applied by Israeli authorities because she was writing against them. And then in the latest events in Palestine, she was beaten by the local authorities because she was reporting the demonstrations against them. And she was harassed by Hamas because she was writing pieces against them. Like, she was literally harassed by every single authority in her country. And that's why she actually won the independence. And now there is a campaign for her to get her travel ban removed and be able to travel. And finally, that's Nawara Najm. She's Egyptian. She used to be a pioneering and very, very well-known figure of the Egypt Revolution in 2011, and now she completely disappeared. If you look her up on social media, you wouldn't be able to find her because her bio on Facebook says, "I am not Noura." She is a journalist. She decided a couple of years ago to take her headscarf off, and that was her end. She was followed by more than 2 to 3 millions among Twitter and Facebook. And they just couldn't handle her taking a personal decision and taking off her headscarf. She was attacked, bullied, so harsh, and all of the exposable pictures that were sent to Nidal, they were sent to her too. And it was just too much for her and her family that she completely withdrew from public sphere. And now she rarely writes very unchallenging and social-related pieces in the media. So going back to objectiveness and distance from the sources, that man shouting with a red T-shirt in the picture, that's the father of my daughter, and that is East Aleppo 2016. There was a barrel bomb next to our house, and he was running to help the people. And it's an awful picture. He hates me always for putting it. But that was one of the few incidents where I decided to actually be a guest for BBC to speak about, because I witnessed the massacre, and I'm one of the very few English speakers at that time in Aleppo. I was taken as an eyewitness, certainly, not a journalist. But then reporting about something that you've seen is one thing, but reporting on your friends, your family, the school that you used to pass by on every day, your ex-boyfriend, your extended cousins is something else. How is that being perceived? How is that supposed to be perceived? Refugees, displacement, chemical attack, caliphate, these are all the lives of Syrians and are the lives of those who are covering it. The 5 Ws that you all learn when you're writing the news are literally their daily life of local journalists. Until recently, we were considered as not objective because as local journalists, we can't actually put distance from our sources, which are eventually our community. Well, luckily, thanks to the Ukrainian war, that is being challenged. Being in the story, and that's my personal belief, doesn't affect your objectiveness. It surely enriches your understanding of the context. If you want to be objective and professional, you can do that whether you're reporting about a very personal related story or reporting about an international one. And I think Ukraine war proved that such accusations are rather colonial and white supremacy oriented than professional ethics. I couldn't believe in the last 2 weeks the kind of coverage that the international community, and specifically some of the people who, like, to me were saying that I am unobjective, and they can't take my reporting on Syria objectively because I'm Syrian. And when reporting on Ukraine, they were crying on the TV, they were like so emotional, sensational language I'm not personally against because they're victims and they deserve to have such an empathy even on air. But this double standards of treating local journalists who are using the same exact language and the same exact emotions and passion when a neighboring country is actually going that war, I think I would love to see like a thorough study and comparison study about this. So to end up, I wrote something very quickly, and I was shocked how many shares it got, not just from Arabic fellows in the region, from Hong Kongan journalists, from Filipino journalists, and then I realized that this thing is actually very common in the global south. It's not just in our region. At the beginning of the Ukrainian invasion, it got lots of memories, especially for us, because maybe it's the same invader, the same images, different coverage though. So I decided to write 10 pieces of advice for foreign journalists covering that conflict. I'm going to read them out to you if they're not obvious. Local journalists are not your free of charge fixers. If you are asking for their sources, include their names in the bylines next to yours. The security of the locals are more important than your story. Listen to the locals, don't enforce your perspective on them, and you can't believe how many foreign journalists do that. 4, ask the people you interview, how are you? Empathize with them before getting to their quotes. One of the most annoying issues I was facing when I was in Aleppo is that many journalists would approach me, hi Zeina, we have these questions, can you answer them? I was like, just ask me how I am. Like, regardless whether you know me or not, we were interacting. But that was very dehumanizing. And I was a journalist, I'm not just like any citizen that they're approaching, so they should be even treating me with more cautious because I can speak out. Your translator and interviewees are at risk working with you. Be considerate. You are not the story. And that's a very essential point for me because many foreign journalists make the story about them, not about the people that they're reporting. Locals do not need you to be their voice. Pass over your privileged mic to allow them to express themselves in their own words. Help local journalists in pitching their stories instead of quoting them into your own piece. I know for freelancers, it's more difficult because you need to get funding to get your pieces out. But I think as you're getting something from local journalists, from locals, you need to give them back something at least. Using local journalist idea to create your own content is a breach for copyright, in my opinion, even if they shared them with you over a friendly lunch. I personally was faced, I didn't even realize how abusive was that, but in many cases I would meet like a filmmaker or a journalist, once even a BBC working on a series of 4 documentaries about Syria, and she was like, we're thinking about this, what do you think we should do? and whom should we interview? And I was like, you know that you're asking me for all my sources and my idea. And she was like, yes, but that will be beneficial for your home country and for your cause. And I was like, if I asked you to give me your contacts for something about Britain, would you give it to me? And she bluntly said no. Again, we need to think, why is that? Finally, you know the list of Ukraine or any other country, the war, local journalists and the people are the experts, so treat them as so. And that's the end for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Zeina, for this master class. Really, I'm sure for many of the students here, this has really been a proper lesson in do's and don'ts.
Are you depressed yet?
I think fundamentally the message of think, like that mantra of think locally and act globally. There is a very important element of think locally, or think of the locals rather, in order to avoid misconceptions, in order to avoid a lack of rigor in how you report, in order to avoid also essentialism, Eurocentrism, a series of like Leila said at the beginning, provide context of the story that you're going to cover with the help of the people who know, especially if you're new in the subject. Also the plight of the locals in terms of how a journalist that does not have the same privileges that you have in terms of mobility, in terms of being able to, in terms of resources, those are things I think are very important, and also in terms of being an independent journalist, which is probably how some of you will start as well. Consider all those limitations and all the dangers that being an independent journalist in a conflict zone entails. Not having the proper training in terms of hostile environment. I think, I myself, years ago when I worked for the BBC, I got this training, the hostile environment, the HEFAT, and I know for a fact that so many people cannot access that training because it's extremely expensive. It's given by specialists, former soldiers, etc., and you really get to understand much better how to move in a conflict zone. It's not as easy of, teacher, how can I go to Ukraine? It has so many possibilities of going wrong that you need to be very aware of this. But mostly I think the plight of women and journalists and this hierarchy and patriarchy that still exists in the newsroom, not only the Middle East, but pretty much in this country as well. I mean, as you say, we get to see so many women journalists presenting the news, being an anchor, also providing the coverage, but very seldom we see them in higher echelons or in higher positions as editors in the newsroom. So that also I think applies to not only the Middle East and North Africa context. Anyway, that's sort of like my very short summary. Leila, I don't know if you want to comment something before we start receiving the questions.
Yeah, well, I want to ask you, how are you?
I'm very good now, thank you.
It's difficult to say anything after all of this, Zeina, but thank you so much for your humanity. And I think it all comes down to that. I mean, respect and empathy with the people you're working with. I also got a lot of requests when it was, especially during the bombing of Aleppo. And I got requests from Spanish and international journalists, Leila, we want someone in Aleppo who speaks Spanish, who is a woman, who's like, yeah, what else do you want? I mean, and then a month later, they would ask me again. I mean, nurture the relationship. Ask them afterwards how they're doing. And remember that they're going through a horrific situation. They don't owe you anything. And it's your duty to protect them, even if they're desperate. And they say, I don't care. I've had people tell me, share my name, share my picture. I lost my children. What do I care? It's my duty to say, even if you're saying this, it's my duty to protect you, and I will not share your name, and I will not share your identity, because I can take some distance, and people who are under these horrific situations, they can't always make these decisions and protect themselves. So I was very concerned, Zeina, about what you mentioned, and I see this a lot. The violence, women who have a public profile face, we've spoken about this in class, but if you're a journalist in such a repressive context, I'm very concerned, because this leads to self-censorship. This has a chilling effect. We've talked about chilling effect, and sometimes it's very difficult to measure. The things that we don't get to read, the things that we don't see published or spoken are very difficult to measure. But violence against women human rights defenders and women journalists have a chilling effect on freedom of expression and make us poor as a society. So thanks a lot, Zeina. I want us to talk about many more things, but I think let's throw the ball to the rest of the people here with us and see where their interests are. And then I have a million questions for you, but I'd rather hear from them.
Okay, do we have any raised hands? Any questions, comments? Sí, por aquí en la fila.
Yes, there's a question here. Row 6. Somebody's got their hand up. You can ask your question in Spanish or in English, as you prefer.
I have two questions. I was wondering why or how would you explain the fact that you've accomplished and reached what you wanted to do as a journalist, as a woman also, whereas other women may not have, because, I mean, a lot of reasons, but what do you have in extra, if that makes sense, you know? And my second question would be, it's a complicated one, but it would, like, what would be the solution of those problems? And I think it's systematic and global issue, but what would be one part of the solution, or, you know, yeah, that would be my questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, for the first one, I don't think I have anything extra. One of the things I had was that I wasn't privileged at all growing up. I'm coming from lower middle class, conservative community. I don't have journalists in my family. I don't have writers. I'm in an area that is called, in the Syrian context, a forgotten city. I think the only privilege I had at that time is that I had an open-minded mother who supported me to study journalism, and that was it. I think I was privileged to be able to speak English, and that helped me to get a scholarship to do my master's degree in Britain, and then that led for me to be taken a bit extra seriously, and that led for my work to be recognized. But I don't think I've reached where I wanted in journalism. I've never wanted to work outside my home country. I've never wanted to even write in English or any other language. I've always wanted to report locally and stayed in my home country, and I'm in a different space. About the solutions, I think we all need to think about them. In my own perspective, commenting on Layla's latest point, what I am doing to help women stay in public spaces or on social media, as the policies of Twitter and Facebook are not doing anything to help them out, is that whenever I'm seeing a woman journalist or a woman human rights defender being attacked, I try to respond on her behalf because I'm less stressed. The attack is not personal against me, and I can respond. Worst case scenario, I would just send her a message or contact her and tell her, like, I've been there before, they're bulliers, they're trying to get you out. This regional feminist network that we established, I think this is one of the very few good things about social media recently, is one of the reasons why I personally still online, despite having 3-4 systemically. You know, even the latest 10 points that I wrote, and I wrote them in English, and they're directed to foreign journalists, but there were more than 20 posts saying that I am acting like those journalists by Syrian men. Well, God knows, I've never been a foreigner. I've lived all my life in Syria, but I mean, it doesn't matter what you write. They will always find a point to attack you from, whatever you do. So for me personally, I would support women journalists. I trained women journalists in many cases without having a program or without having support. I am doing mentorship for lots of women within my work and outside my work. I try to connect them with the sources international, using the privilege I have as a person who lives abroad to help them out. I think if there are more of us, we will be able to be more effective. And I think also working on our colleagues, male colleagues, who don't see things from our perspective, and having them as allies on our side is also really essential. And if they can also respond on our behalf when we're being bullied or attacked sexually is also really essential. So building this alliance could also be one of the elements, and passing our privilege forward, whether it's mentorship, whether it's helping out with pitching, whether even sharing opportunities that other less privileged women can apply for. I think maybe on the long term we could do some change.
Those are great things.
More questions? Yes?
Maybe we can take two.
This one, and then in the back le damos después la palabra al...
And we'll give the floor later to the chap behind.
I would like to ask you to give us like an advice or something, because we're growing to be journalists in a society that we consider that has a lot of conflict and that has grown with social media, that we basically are starting not to shut things up. So I like to have like an advice or something that you would like to say to us, that we grow wanting to go to these places and wanting to report things that before were more complicated to see the truth. So something that you could give us to encourage for this.
Okay, can you hold that one?
Yeah.
And just
Thinking.
cogemos la pregunta de atrás.
Should we take the question from the person in red at the back of the room, please?
I think oftentimes in the Western world, when speaking about the suppression of women in the Arab world, people tend to blame it on religion a lot of the time. At least from my experience, that's what it seems like. So my question to you is, what role does religion play in the suppression of women in the Arab world and the Muslim world? Does it really play that big of a role, or is that just a misconception that has been carried throughout time?
Thank you. For the first question, I don't think I'm in a position to give advice, but if I were you and I wanted myself to tell me something, I would have told myself to keep focus, stay focused, because now you are being pushed by social media, by mainstream media to be the hero, and being a hero means going to the extreme cases. If you're not in a war, your word wouldn't be noticed. Now we're seeing the most distinguished investigative pieces are being done in the New York Times in a small office where they investigate open source sources and come up with debunk misinformation campaigns, systematic ones. I mean, maybe getting away from these stereotypes that you need to get some action and bumps to be able to be noticed, to be recognized. I would certainly advise myself not to go with that. There are plenty of local issues that are certainly undercovered. I would have stayed and covered that before aiming to go to other countries or other contexts that I don't get and I don't understand. I personally wouldn't have gone to any other wars. I've never imagined I'm going to be our correspondent. As Layla mentioned, war came, knocked on my door, but I wouldn't report or travel to another war to report it. Now, I think working in Iraq, which is not an active war, it's still war, but post-war, some kind of in between. After 15 years of staying in my country, and I understand the language and I understand the context, but I still feel very hesitant to write about it, although I've been working in it for 5 years. So I don't really get this entitlement of journalists being parachuted into a conflict for 3-4 days and writing a story describing what the conflict is. So maybe studying the context of these different countries more, working more with local journalists, maybe co-authoring. I would have loved for such networks to flourish between journalists from different regions working together on productions. The most successful latest investigation pieces, big SOS investigations, and the Panama Papers, they were collaboration work. Well, funded by international organizations, but I mean, what make it really successful is the collaboration between different journalists from around the region, each in their own countries. I think I would have, if I want to give myself an advice, I would have certainly encouraged myself to think more about this rather than just going to the other country and report it. For the second question, again, I'm not expert in sociology. I'm speaking more about what I've witnessed, what I'm witnessing, my personal experience. In my conservative community, the men who suppressed me were not religious. They were like the one who I'm not going to be mentioning now. He used to drink, but he didn't accept the fact that I refused to put my headscarf, because in many cases, traditions are more important than God himself. So it depends. It could be different from town to town, from city to city, different. And speaking about, literally in my province, there are more than 30 dialects. Some of them I don't even understand when they speak fast. So to speak about one tradition or generalize it to even a province in one country of the MENA region is impossible. I think one of the main elements that I learned during the last 15 years, I would never generalize even on my own family. Each of us has different perspectives, different expectations, different results caused by different issues. And sadly, I don't have a better answer for your question.
Mm-hmm. We have a set of more questions, so we're going to take those two in the back. Primero las de atrás, si quieres, por favor.
First, the questions at the back, if you like.
Okay, so my question is, if you think the idea we have here of the Middle East, like here in our Western country position, is real, or is just like an illusion we created from our privileged position? And I think the answer is yes. So what can we do to improve that situation from our own privileged position?
Okay, so I wanted to ask, what would you say to people who are living the same situations that you did, like the censorship and all of those things, mainly children and mainly girls? What would you say, if you could, to them? And my other question is, are you happy, are you proud of what you have accomplished, even though those situations that you had to face? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, the first answer, I don't know the community here, and maybe I'm privileged enough to only meet the right people, like you guys. So I haven't met far-right anti-immigrants people, alhamdulillah. I don't know, but for example, in British media, which I follow, I can say certainly that they have very much colonized, stereotypical look. One of the main things that I always hear whenever I go, whenever I speak in an event, you're Syrian? You don't look like a refugee? And okay, wait, I will shed some tears and carry 2 kids with me so you can actually believe I am a refugee. What I would do if I was British, I would certainly listen and give my privileged mic to others, so to explore, to raise the volume of their voices, give them platforms, put their words in their own ways in whatever platforms I have. And I think one of the main changes that I would have done is actually change the minds of my friends and family and community, because this is how things spread. One of the impressive things I've seen with the first immigration crisis that happened after the Syrian war, there are some very small publications in Spain and Germany, and I saw some translation. For the first time, they actually tried to put faces on the numbers, and they were treating those immigrants as humans, and I think that made difference, as we're seeing now, because we're seeing the victims of the Ukrainians. We didn't get numbers. We don't see breaking news numbers, how many people. We're seeing the picture of the pregnant woman who was killed by attacking the maternity hospital. We know her name. We've seen her picture before being attacked. We can connect with her. I think dehumanizing is one of the main issues that spread hate and stereotypes, and to face it, we just need to do the opposite. The second question, the advice for little girls or people who are still living there. Well, I think one of the main difficulties is that they can't hear me. Even when working with women and journalists who live in Damascus, which is under the control of the regime, I need to use different name and different email address, because even my name is a threat. I'm just a journalist. I'm not like a military or politicians or whatever. So that's my first fear. But if I would tell myself something when I was a little girl, I would just tell her that the world is big and change is there. I would never believe that if I told myself it then, but maybe it would have helped me to understand where I am and where I'm heading. The last one is whether I'm proud. It's very difficult. I don't think I'm even satisfied yet. I haven't completely passed this self-censorship that I had to apply on myself for so long. And when you do that for so long, it becomes really struggle. My main mental issues now are not really related to seeing bodies and blood and post-traumatic stress. My main mental struggle is breaking free from my own censorship. And the social media and the bullying campaign are not making this easy on me, because even when I'm writing a piece, and I rarely write now, I read the bullier's comment on it in my head. And in many cases, I would rephrase, and then I realize what is happening. And this is very scary for me, because I consider myself like a shameless and very powerful person. So I can imagine what would happen with a woman who just graduates and is facing such an act.
I was going to ask precisely about deprogramming. How do you deprogram yourself after so many years of that? But that's a question I wanted to ask, but I've just said it, but I will just give the voice to these two young ladies here.
So first of all, I would like to thank you. Such an amazing and interesting speech. I think it was very encouraging for us, and mainly for the women journalists, or the women that will become journalists here in this class. And my question is, how do you see the future of journalism for women? And do you think that we can break those male or sexist patterns that surround us, and how? Thank you.
I would also like to extend the sentiments of gratitude and appreciation. I think your honesty and your authenticity is something that is very much cherished, especially among young people here. I very much appreciate hearing the authenticity of your responses. So thank you for that. And my question for you is, how would you say the challenges you have faced in your career impacted your personal writing style and the extent to which you were able to safely and with authenticity convey your voice when reporting? So it's quite long.
Very hard question, guys. So the first one, in the MENA region, within the current circumstances, I'm not very optimistic about the scene for women journalists. I'm very happy that despite all of this gloomy laws, political issues, militias, chaos, women are still encouraged to be journalists. But what's going to be happening to them later on, I don't know. But I think the fact that they're still determined to study and work in such a field is inspiring. And that's why I stopped being a journalist myself. And all what I'm doing is literally working with other journalists, mainly women. In general, I don't know, but I'm seeing, for example, in the Ukrainian coverage, I noticed that most of the British media actually sent women journalists to cover it. But again, the privileged, and those are elderly, stars, whatever, but I mean, maybe that would change even our perspective of seeing a man journalist in the conflict. And even during Iraq war, there were many Lebanese journalists, women journalists actually, who were sent to cover it. So hopefully, I can say, hopefully that would change, but generally I'm not that optimistic. I'm sorry for this. The second question about whether it affected my personality, well, certainly. I think being a journalist before war has changed my personality, and being a journalist feminist, it completely changed who I am. I think one of the main elements is unprogramming all the propaganda, sexism, racism implemented unconsciously by my state and my community in me. And that is very difficult, because sometimes you mix up between, is this a tradition I'm supposed to carry on because I am connected to that country, or is it a bad thing that I should actually let go, and you will pay the price for that? So I'm not sure I find the right balance yet. I'm still struggling in between. And how I'm continuing my authentic approach in terms of my work. Is that the second question? Did I understand you right? Yes. I think this is all what I have. I'm not a white privileged journalist who can just speak about others and get all the platforms open for her. I am here because I've lived what I lived, and because I'm sharing it frankly with those that I hope they will never face the same challenges, and they can actually change gradually on their own base without having to survive a war.
Muy bien, we're going to have two last questions. Una aquí.
One question over here.
You can hear me. This is more of a personal question, so just answer to the extent that you feel comfortable with. But I'm really curious to know what comes next for you after everything you've gone through, and also what would your highest hopes be for your future?
I would like to ask, how did you face finding out that your own country wasn't what you thought it was because of disinformation, and what did you do at the time? I mean, immediately, what how did you act? Did that encourage you to become a journalist? Did that motivated you to start finding out? And do you ever think about how would that be your life if you wouldn't start informating yourself?
Well, thank you. I'll start with that answer and then I'll get back to you. I was already studying journalism, actually working as a journalist when that window was opened in my tiny bubble, brainwashed bubble. How I felt, it was awkward. It's as if, you know, what was the name of the film, One Man Show? Have you seen it? Oh, maybe I'm too old. It's a film about the character who, Truman Show. Okay, Truman Show. It's literally that moment when he discovered that there is a world behind the show. That was for me, especially that I was able to read some familiar names, the father of someone that I know, but she didn't even dare to tell me that her father. And then I realized, after becoming a journalist and knowing that I live in a dictatorship, that half of my mother family was actually killed in the 80s by Hafez al-Assad, the previous president, because they were accused of being Muslim Brotherhoods and different reasons, and that there was a helicopter who came to our farm to capture some people in my family. And my family kept this secret 20 years until I accidentally discovered some name which I knew. So imagine, like, you feel betrayal, you feel angry, but you certainly understand, because if I said anything at school, they would have taken my family into prison for understanding that. So it was an enlightenment moment, but it was a very scary. I've never practiced actual fear from the state until that moment, and it doesn't go. When it comes, it stays. So at some point, I wish I would have lived all my life as a brainwash. It's much more easier to just one party, one state, one leader, one media. You don't need to struggle. But no, certainly, I'm grateful for having that access, and I feel really passionate about access for information because of that, because I know how powerful free access for information is, and how dangerous not having that on the mentalities of the people, mobilization, and all this crisis that we're facing. Does that answer your question? Okay, where I see myself. Sadly, like the extreme targets I've been working on for the last 4 years is having a passport that everyone else is born with. I'm gonna be a human being on the edge of 40. And I'm planning to travel freely without having to jump from a consulate to another, trying to prove that I'm not terrorist because I was accidentally born in that country or another. So I can't really focus on anything. Now I'm feeling scared that when I actually get the passport, I will be depressed because I've been only looking towards that moment. And when it comes, I will then start questioning myself, who I am and what I'm going to be doing in my life. So wish me luck.
So I'd like to thank Zeina for sharing with us all her insights and these personal stories as well. It is true that we have, until last Thursday, we weren't sure that we would get Zeina's visa to come to Madrid. So we are delighted to have been able to bring her over. And therefore, we are extremely delighted that she has a dedicated audience like you. Thanks a lot, obviously, for your attendance and for the effort of the Carlos III University of Madrid and of Leila as your teacher. I don't know if Leila has final words before we say farewell.
I just want to say I'm very proud of you. Thank you so much for being so into it. Thanks so much for coming here. And thank you so much, Zeina. Sure.
And I think one of the main questions, lessons, besides the humility, is the fact that what you mentioned, how humanize our stories, how to put faces into those stories that we carry on reproducing, and mention statistics that have behind them a proper story. A few years ago, there was a very sad airplane accident here in Spain, and one of the main lessons, I think, in journalism was that there was a very clear effort to tell the stories behind the 200 and something passengers who lost their lives in the planes. And I know for a fact that in many other countries affected by drug trafficking and mafias and all that, it's also just a matter of mentioning numbers, just like in stories such as Syria or Iraq or Libya or Yemen or Ukraine. So it's very important to humanize it, to really tell the stories behind it, and you don't need to travel so far to these conflict-ridden zones to be able to transmit that. So thank you very much for inspiring us. Muchísimas gracias a vosotros.
Thank you very much to you all for coming this afternoon. Thank you for our interpreters and those of you who are following us on YouTube. And we'll continue with our university classes. And if you're interested, we have a great many other subjects that we'll be touching upon. And we'll come back to freedom of press in May again on the International Day for Press Freedom. We don't yet know who's going to come as a guest, but it will probably be a surprise for you. And if you're interested, we hope that you will come to Casa Árabe and we'll follow each other on social media. See you next time. Bye-bye.